You're tuned in to the Dr. Kinney Show, and I'm your host, Dr. Erin Kinney, a naturopathic doctor and speaker dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of your body and guiding you back into balance. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of the Dr. Kinney Show. And this episode, I am going to be chatting about cortisol and its role with autoimmune diseases. So we diagnose and treat quite a few different types of autoimmune conditions. Hashimoto, so an autoimmune thyroid condition, is probably the number one thing that we diagnose and that we treat. And I want to talk about the importance of your adrenals and particularly cortisol and how that can impact, one, the development of an autoimmune disease, and two, the management and treatment of it. So first thing, I've done a lot of episodes on cortisol, but I'm going to just do a couple of, reminders about the importance of cortisol and kind of what that hormone does. So cortisol, we think of it as the stress hormone, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It is more so the hormone that your body makes in response to stress in order to give you energy to deal with stress. So it is the stress hormone, but more importantly, it is an energy hormone. And it's also the hormone that gets produced that wakes you up in the morning. So cortisol controls our circadian rhythm. And the third and probably most important thing for this topic today is that cortisol plays a major role as an anti-inflammatory molecule in the body. It is our body's natural prednisone. So when we have any sort of inflammation in the body, cortisol exists to go and help the body reduce that inflammation. And at most autoimmune diseases, inflammation is a big piece in the development of that. So we always want to be thinking about how can we make sure our body has all of the anti-inflammatory capabilities that it needs. So keeping cortisol in a good, healthy level is very, very important when we're dealing with an autoimmune condition. But before we get there, let me first talk about what kind of things can help or can cause the body to develop an autoimmune condition. And, an autoimmune condition is any condition where the body is attacking its own cells, which is not something that our bodies are designed to do. Our body doesn't just wake up one morning and be like, oh, hey, let me attack the thyroid because I don't like the thyroid anymore. Our body likes itself. Like it's against, survival for us to attack ourselves. But sometimes the system gets in such a state and it gets a little bit confused, particularly the immune system, and it will start attacking itself. And when that happens, particularly the thyroid, we will then see damage to that thyroid tissue. The thyroid doesn't function as well, and we get all kinds of problems. This can also occur in the joints and the muscle tissue. Autoimmune stuff, it doesn't really differentiate. The body can develop all kinds of different autoimmune states, but the development of autoimmune things it's kind of the same. So if we think to, the concept of, or the term fight flight, which is what we call the nervous system when it's in that activated stress state, most of us, and I think this too, when we think of fight or flight, we think of, oh, I'm fighting a tiger or I'm running from the tiger. That's true, but fighting can also be something that's happening internally. It could be your immune system is fighting a cold or fighting a virus or fighting a bacteria. And oftentimes what can happen is when we're in a chronic stressed state, so if our cortisol levels are initially high because the body's like, oh my God, I gotta fight or run from something, that high cortisol, one of its jobs is to tell the immune system, hey, we're in a stress state. You better be ready to fight something, right? So let's say that happens and we're fighting something, but there's nothing to fight internally. There's no infection. There's nothing going on. If your immune system gets so riled up and so like, all right, I'm ready to fight, sometimes it might start attacking itself. So again, if the immune system is like, oh my God, I keep getting signals to go into fight flight state and I'm not coming out of it, I better find something to attack because it thinks it's supposed to be attacking something. So it's really, this is why, we talk about, hey, you got to reduce your stress. You got to reduce your stress. We don't want the system to be constantly in that fight flight state, because if it is, and there's nothing for it to fight, it will find something to fight. And this is often how the development of allergies happen. So we think about pollen, for example, which a lot of people are allergic to. Pollen is benign. It gets into your system. It's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It doesn't really do anything. But if you're in a really stressed out state for a prolonged period of time and you keep getting exposed to pollen, the body's like, well, you know what? Maybe I should attack this pollen. So we develop an allergy to it. The body starts making antibodies to it. And then, again, if we stay in that, stress state even longer, sometimes an autoimmune thing can start to creep up. So that's kind of the one underlying issue in the development of an autoimmune disease is when our cortisol levels are acutely very, very high for a long period of time because of some sort of chronic stress situation, we are at a higher risk of making our immune system go a little haywire and start to attack itself. Now, what will happen, and you guys, if you've listened to my episodes on cortisol, is what tends to happen is if we've been pumping out a lot of cortisol, during that time, we usually don't sleep very well. We're not resting a lot because we're in that fight-flight state. And sometimes you feel pretty good in that first state. But what will happen is over time, cortisol levels will actually start to decline. And as they start to decline, we lose some of this ability to, one, have energy and do things, which none of us like, but two, and more importantly, again, for this autoimmune talk today, is as those levels start to decline, we don't have as much anti-inflammatory capability. And so if we're already in a little bit of a state where our immune system has been a little bit more attacky, it's like attacking things it shouldn't be, and then we start to have unchecked inflammation in the body, this is kind of like a perfect storm state where the body's like, oh, there's a lot of inflammation over there. Inflammation also makes the immune system go nuts. The body's like, something's inflamed. I better try to send some immune cells over there to try to fix it. So if we've got, if the immune system was already kind of making some antibodies about something, and then we don't have as much anti-inflammatory, there's all this, inflammation going on, this can cause the body to think that there's maybe something living in there and it might try to attack it. So that, the long-term stress causing the adrenal or cortisol crash can, again, put you more at risk for an autoimmune disease development. Now, the next thing that is really important to understand and, in this, autoimmune development role is the role that stealth infections or chronic infections can play. And I've done many episodes talking about, the role of chronic stealth infections and how it impacts hormones and kind of the other things it can impact. But if there's something living in your body that shouldn't be living in there, this is when we want the immune system to be attacking it, right? So let's say you get the flu, your immune system is going to go nuts. It's going to try to kill the flu virus. Great job, immune system. Now, when we are fighting something that we call a stealth infection, and so the two biggest ones and the ones I'll talk about today are Lyme disease and Epstein-Barr virus, which is the virus that can cause mono. These infections, they like to hide from your immune system. It's how they survive longer, is they're really good at hiding in the tissue so the immune system can't find them. But our immune system is pretty smart. It knows that they're there. It's like, okay, I know that there's something living in that thyroid tissue or in those joints. So the Epstein-Barr really loves the thyroid tissue. Lyme typically loves the joints but can go anywhere. So the body's like, I know it's there. I want to try to attack it. And as it goes to try to attack it, it will sometimes end up making antibodies to the tissue itself. So, in this situation, your body is actually, it's trying to protect you, but it's struggling. Now, if your body's doing this for a long time, if it's like been fighting, a low-level Lyme or a low-level, Epstein-Barr infection for a year plus, that's exhausting for your body. And that means your body's been in that, that hyped up stress state for a while, which will cause a depletion of cortisol. So one of the most common things I see that causes crashed out adrenals are these stealth infections. And so if we're in that state where cortisol is low, inflammation is going to go up, and there's also something living there, that's pretty much the perfect storm for some sort of autoimmune thing to develop. So there are other things you can have. Let's say you have a really bad food sensitivity or a food allergy. We can use gluten and dairy for an example. Let's say you continually eat them. That can kick up some inflammation in the small intestine. Your small intestine is where the majority of your immune system lives. If we've got tons of inflammation there, your immune system, again, is going to go a little haywire. That can, contribute to this, perfect storm for autoimmune thing as well. So looking at diet, making sure that you are, testing for things that you might be sensitive to and make sure you're not consuming those foods. So if you've got that in addition to the lower cortisol and the stealth infection, again, that's kind of creating this perfect storm situation. So this is kind of some of the things that can contribute to the development of those autoimmune conditions. Now, let's say we already have, hey, I've got Hashimoto's or I have rheumatoid arthritis or I have, some sort of autoimmune condition. And you're like, okay, I need to know what can I do holistically or naturally to kind of work on this? Well, as we've mentioned several times already, when cortisol levels are low, you don't have your anti-inflammatory capability in the body. So
getting your cortisol levels to an adequate, healthy place is the number one most important thing when I'm trying to treat someone with autoimmune condition. And sometimes, you may still be stuck in that really high state. We see people when they come in and their cortisol levels are through the roof. So working on lowering those. Oftentimes and more often than not with my Hashimoto's patients in particular, we'll see cortisol levels be really, really low. So making sure that we're helping their adrenals out so that they can help, the body can start to lower that inflammation, which will then in turn help us be able to calm the immune system down. Because that's really ultimately when you are treating an autoimmune disease, we want to calm the immune system down. Western medicine, and there's something against this, but Western medicine will use medications that essentially shut off your immune system. They completely render your immune system ineffective, which works, right? Then the immune system doesn't attack anything. So Western medicine, likes to use these medications that completely render the immune system ineffective, which is great for the autoimmune part, but then it's not so great if you encounter someone who's sick or, it makes your immune system not work right. And it's really interesting. A lot of the big gun autoimmune drugs, let's take methotrexate, for example. If you've got an autoimmune condition and you take methotrexate for long enough, it's not a matter of if you will get cancer. You eventually will get some sort of cancer. Now, it's really interesting. They also use methotrexate for cancer patients. And if you use it that way, at some point it will treat your cancer, but it could give you an autoimmune disease. So these medications, they have big side effects, big risks, and, in some cases, they are necessary and warranted, but a lot of patients come to me and they're like, hey, I'm really scared of this medication. I don't want to be more at higher risk for cancer. I don't want to have, immune system where I can't go out and see my friends or can't travel. So, from a holistic perspective, when we're looking at autoimmune diseases, again, first goal is we have to get your cortisol regulated. Second goal is we need to calm your immune system down. And most of that is done by regulating your cortisol and making sure we're not constantly stuck in fight flight. So we want to train the nervous system that it is okay to calm down, which then will train the immune system that it is okay to not be constantly on the attack. So those are the things that I kind of look at when I'm looking holistically at a patient with any autoimmune disease. And obviously we're checking all their levels and we'll look at inflammatory markers, but making sure their body has that innate anti-inflammatory cortisol healing thing is really, really important. And I think that's the reason why, keeping your stress levels down and kind of helping your nervous system to get in balance is so effective. I think if you have an autoimmune disease, when you're super stressed out, you're going to get a flare, right? And I see this with my thyroid patients. When they go through periods of high stress, their thyroid antibodies go through the roof. They don't feel well. Their medication doesn't work anymore. They have all the symptoms. When their nervous system calms down, they feel better. So, and sometimes it's as simple as just making sure you take enough time in your day to calm your nervous system down. And that can be really, really helpful. Sometimes there can be some more complicated things we want to look at. There are some other nutrients and other things we can use that do stabilize and calm the immune system. So taking things that help stabilize histamine or help, because when your histamine levels get out of control, that can also kick up a lot of inflammation. So things like quercetin and vitamin C and, all the basic nutrients are going to help keep the immune system more stable. And then there are different herbs. I'm a really big fan of mushrooms in general. So medicinal mushrooms can be really helpful for balancing your immune system, for keeping it where it can fight something that it should be fighting, but keeping it from over attacking its own cells. So it's I like mushrooms. I like to think of them as they help train your immune system to know what they should fight and what they shouldn't. And oftentimes with an autoimmune condition where we are making antibodies to things, which is one of the most common ways that the body will will create an autoimmune disease. And when we're making so many antibodies, antibody production is very time and energy consuming for the body. So it's a high energy process. So it drains your body when you make a lot of antibodies. That's one way the immune system fights something, is with antibody production. The second way is through T cells, which are very specific white blood cells. I like to think of them as your sniper cells. They go and they shoot and they kill whatever they're trying to kill directly on impact, versus an antibody where, let's say, you've got this virus or something here. your body will send an antibody to connect with it. And the antibody is it's like a lock and key thing. It molds to it, but the antibody itself doesn't actually kill whatever it's trying to kill. This other complex called a macrophage will come and it eats the whole complex and kills it. So there's a several step process that has to happen in order for an antibody to actually get rid of something versus those T cells, which shoot and kill things directly on impact. In a healthy immune system, we have both of those things. We've got a good antibody production and we have a good T cell production. And in a lot of the patients that I treat with autoimmune disease, we'll see crazy levels of antibodies for against thyroid or joints or whatever we're seeing, but they have really low levels of T cells. So, and again, that can come from chronically, overproducing cortisol and then underproducing cortisol based on the nervous system stuff. That can also come from lack of certain nutrients and like some gut dysregulation. But I was going down this line because I really love mushrooms, because one of the things they will do is they will balance the antibody production versus the T cell production. So again, they help to keep things balanced. With medicinal mushrooms, you can take them in a capsule, in a tincture. You can also eat, fold them into your diet. They are fantastic, again, for immune support and immune regulation, which is kind of, the important thing here when we're dealing with autoimmune stuff is we want to make sure we're regulating that immune system so it's not spinning out of control. So when we're, again, coming back to the cortisol piece, trying to keep your cortisol balanced, it's actually simpler than you would think. It's really about maintaining a good, healthy circadian rhythm. Means having a good sleep routine, sleep hygiene. So making sure that you are winding down in the evening. I usually tell my patients, I'm like, it's great to be asleep by 10, if possible. The hours before midnight are really healing and rejuvenating for the body. So it's better to go to sleep at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6 than it is to go to sleep at midnight and wake up at 8. Even though it's the same length of sleep, the body will get more healing power, again, in those 2 hours before midnight. And this is because when you go to bed at 10, you wake up at 6, you're more with the natural circadian rhythm of the earth. Now, in the winter, obviously, when it's a little bit darker, most of us want to go to sleep a little early. And we want to wake up a little bit later because our bodies were supposed to be in tune with the sun, and the rhythms of the earth. In today's world, we have lots of artificial lighting. We're not necessarily being governed by the sun, which is okay. But, some of the simple things you can do is to try to get your sleep rhythm back into something where you're, one, getting enough sleep, but going to bed at a decent hour and waking up, with the sun-ish. You don't have to wake up exactly with the sun, but ish is kind of a nice thing to try to, a nice goal to get to. So, trying to maintain a healthy circadian rhythm, getting morning sunlight is also really, really helpful for this. So getting outside in the morning if you can. If that's not feasible for you, I love those light boxes that you can get. There's a brand on Amazon, I think it's called Verilux. They're like $40. You can put those in your bathroom. Really, really helpful for getting some morning-ish sunlight that will help to kind of train your brain, hey, this is when I should be awake. And that will really help with sleep. And again, it kind of helps with that circadian rhythm. When we're getting sunlight directly to the eyes or any sort of light, it tells the pineal gland to stop producing melatonin. And when melatonin is low, the body's like, oh, I'm supposed to be awake right now. So it will drive up the production of cortisol, which is great in the morning. In the evening, if we're getting a lot of light stimulation and we don't have melatonin production, it's going to be harder for us to fall asleep. One, we don't have the melatonin, and two, our body's going to try to pump cortisol up to try to keep us awake because it thinks we're supposed to be awake. So in the evening, it's really great to shut off all blue light in particular, but to try to have low levels of light. Again, this is where like that sleep hygiene is really important because, maintaining a healthy cortisol production, the circadian rhythm piece is the number one most important thing. So working on that. And then, the thing I teach my patients a lot and I teach in my workshops is, we're never going to be able to take away all of life's stress, right? Like there's always going to be stuff going on and stuff that our nervous system might react to, and we might go into that fight flight state. And that's okay. We were designed to do that, but we want to make sure we're building in enough downtime, enough time in that rest and digest or parasympathetic state. And this isn't complicated, guys. It can be really simple. It could be 10 minutes of a day where I like to talk about getting horizontal, where you lay down, you close your eyes, you just take a quick reset. I love the laying down piece because it tells the body, hey, it's okay. You can lower the blood pressure. You can lower your blood sugar. You can lower the breath rate, the heart rate, and it kind of hacks your system into more of a parasympathetic state. If you can put that into practice every day for at least 10 minutes, it will start to help your circadian rhythm, and it will help the body make sure it has enough of that cortisol to act as that anti-inflammatory state. And it's a great, I had this professor in like economics in college where, he would always talk about the law of diminishing marginal returns. And the analogy he used was about beer. It was like, oh, you can have 1 or 2 beers and you could still be good at beer pong. But if you drink 10 beers, you're not going to have as much. But so, when we're doing like a 10, let's say we're trying to get something done, right? You're trying to work through a project and it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon when you're kind of like drifting off. Your brain isn't working properly. You could keep pushing through, but at some point that law of diminishing, you're not going to be able to get your stuff done. You're better off going and taking a 10-minute rest or a 10-minute nap and chilling out, because it will allow all of your resources to kind of build back up and then come at it again from like a recharge state. So I've used the analogy of like, it's like plugging in your phone, or it's like putting money in your energy bank account, but having a little bit of a rest time in the middle of the day, it can be kind of life-changing, actually. My patients that adopt it, they'll come back and they're like, oh my God, I feel like I have a whole second day. I take this 20-minute rest right after lunch, and then I'm really productive, versus when I didn't do that, or when I don't do it, I feel like my eyes are closing. I've got to reach for caffeine or sugar, and then I don't sleep as well. And this is what's really common, what I see in, a lot of the patients I work with, is their energy is pretty good during the day. They eat lunch, they crash around 1 or 2, and as they're crashing, they, again, reach for sugar or they go for caffeine. Then they get this caffeinated state, they're awake, they're up, which is fine, but then they have trouble sleeping. So then they don't get as much sleep. So over time, if you keep repeating this cycle, then they're tired in the morning, they go for more caffeine, or they don't get up in the morning. So we start to like affect that circadian rhythm. And not that doing this is going to give you an autoimmune disease. It's not the point of me telling you this, but if you are struggling with an autoimmune disease, making some of these little basic lifestyle shifts, they do make a really big difference, and they really start to add up. So getting some adequate rest, keeping that circadian rhythm in a good, healthy place. And the other thing that I teach and work with my patients on is the rest piece is great. The other thing that we want to make sure you're doing is doing something that brings you joy, right? So a lot of us, we kind of get up, we go to work, we do the kids, then we go to bed. We get up, we do the work. You get kind of stuck in this like rat race of life, and joy, or when you're in a joyful state or you're in a gratitude state, you can't also be in that fight flight state. The joyful state, it's calming. It's like it feels good, and when you feel good, typically we're not in that like fight flight stress state, right? So thinking about, hey, what do I really love to do? What are things that light me up? What are things that, bring me that look on my face that I look like a child who just has seen bubbles for the first time? Like you want to have that feeling. And the more of that feeling you can cultivate throughout your day, that's going to hack you into that parasympathetic state, and it's going to help keep your cortisol levels more balanced. And, in kind of the more like emotional realm, when we think about autoimmune stuff, when we don't feel good, we tend to not be as nice to ourselves, and we tend to have thoughts that we're not nice to ourselves. And I think everyone listening could probably think of a time when, hey, I was really beating myself up about that. And maybe you're someone that's listening, you're like, wow, I beat myself up all the time. I didn't do a great job at this. I didn't exercise. I didn't eat right. Whatever it is, if you think about the energy of that, that's you attacking yourself. So I always talk to my patients with autoimmune conditions like, hey, your thought patterns are really important too. If you're constantly in a thought pattern that is beating yourself up, you're kind of training your body to, like, again, to have the energy of beating yourself up, which in essence is your body attacking, itself physically. So, looking at that is another piece. And the other, as that relates to cortisol, I have some patients that will come in and will be like, yeah, I'm not really, again, my life isn't really, I'm not really that stressed. Like, I don't have anything that is that stressful going on. And sometimes we'll run, to see if there's anything internally stressful, and we don't really find much there. So then we'll kind of start to talk about emotions and thought patterns, and patients are like, well, yeah, I kind of beat myself up. Or I'll even hear it when they come in. They'll be like, oh my God, I hate my body. I hate it's doing this. I hate, I can't lose weight, or I get these headaches and I get so mad at myself. So that thought process is another really good thing to just take note of. And if you're noticing, hey, I do beat myself up a lot, that's the first step, is kind of noticing that, but then maybe trying to find some ways that you can shift that. Hey, can I give myself a little bit of grace? Can I maybe start a gratitude journal where I start to be thankful for my body and tell my body, wow, thank you so much for doing the healing that you're doing, or taking care of me through this stressful time, and just having like a little bit of a shift there can shift the whole energy of your body, which will then start to shift, how the body is attacking itself, or maybe it might stop attacking itself. So, and the other thing was, when you're constantly in a negative thought loop about yourself, that's going to trigger a cortisol spike. That's going to trigger the fight flight thing to get turned on. So even though there's nothing chasing you or nothing bad, when you are thinking negatively about yourself, that triggers your stress response. So that's going to keep the cortisol patterns dysregulated, because we don't really need a high level of cortisol when we have a negative thought about ourselves. It's not, if a lion is chasing us, yes, we want that cortisol level to be elevated so we can use the energy to run and fight. If you have a thought that's negative about yourself, that cortisol is not doing anything. It's just going to go cause trouble, right? So, thinking about and starting to pay attention and witness what your thought patterns are can be a really important part of this healing journey, particularly as it pertains to an autoimmune condition. So a lot of information I just gave you guys, but I do think that it's important to make sure you know what could put you more at risk for an autoimmune disease, because it is something it's common. I'm seeing it a lot more commonly than we used to. And if you are already struggling with an autoimmune disease, I hope some of these things are helpful for you to think about implementing into your life. So hope everyone liked this, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to connect with me on social media to find more helpful tips and information. You can find me at Dr. Kinney on all of the platforms. And please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and/or a review. This helps grow the show so more people have access to this knowledge that leads to empowered healing. Love and light, and see you next week.